While the Equal Rights Amendment strove to ensure equality for women under the Constitution during the 1970s and 80s, it ultimately failed because of internal disagreement among women's organizations and the external pressure to preserve the status quo. The Equal Rights Amendment, otherwise known as the ERA, was a proposed amendment that ensured women's rights under the Constitution. It was a driving force in the 1960s and 70s that engaged the feminist movement. During this period, known as second-wave feminism, feminists and the general society disagreed over the role of women. There were two main thoughts about women's roles in society. Many thought that women should have the same rights as men and should integrate into working environments. Most of the people with this opinion would later go on to support the Equal Rights Amendment. Others believed that a woman's natural job in society was to maintain the household and to be a loyal wife. These people were afraid that the Equal Rights Amendment would change this tradition and disrupt the perfect American family. These differences in opinion spiraled into a huge debate encompassed by the Equal Rights Amendment. Why did the Equal Rights Amendment fail? In the 1920s, the women's suffragist movement united under the common goal to gain voting rights for women. As stated by the 19th Amendment, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Shortly after the ratification of the amendment, Alice Paul, a famous suffragist and leader of the National Women's Party, proposed a new amendment which she believed was the next logical step in guaranteeing women and all citizens of the U.S. equal rights. Written in 1923, the amendment affirmed all women's rights, declaring in Section 1, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." And in Section 2, "The Congress shall have the power to enforce, by appropriate legislation, the provisions of this article." The ERA was introduced in every subsequent session of Congress from 1923 until 1970, when the ERA would again reappear on the political stage. In 1970, pressure was building in Washington for the ERA to be introduced to the Senate and Congress. The newly founded National Organization of Women, otherwise known as NOW, pledged to fight until the ERA was ratified. NOW fulfilled its promise to fight by disrupting subcommittee meetings and protesting at the Capitol. Finally, subcommittee meetings for approval of the ERA were held. 1 month later, because of a discharge petition filed by Martha Griffiths, the ERA left the House Judiciary Committee and was approved by the full House for a vote in 1971. On March 22, 1972, after being approved by the full Senate, the Equal Rights Amendment was sent to the states for ratification with a deadline of 7 years. As passage of the ERA gained momentum, interest in its passage became a topic of conversation in American society. Mainstream organizations and organized labor unions joined together to fight for the ERA. Feminist articles such as those published in Ms. Magazine appeared at an increasing rate. Public support was strong, and in the first year, the amendment gained 22 out of the necessary 38 votes needed for ratification. Women's activist groups like NOW and ERA America saw support increase, and it appeared that the ratification was imminent. The goal of the women's movement began to seem much less foreign to much of middle-class America. However, this feminist trend was short-lived as the anti-ERA movement began to unite. The opposition to the ERA believed that the Equal Rights Amendment would ruin society. People on the opposing side of the debate liked the traditional housewife role for a woman. In 1972, Phyllis Schlafly formed the opposition movement called the National Committee to Stop ERA. Mrs. Schlafly held rallies and organized the Stop ERA campaign, which asserted that the Equal Rights Amendment would change the values of Americans. As Mrs. Harriet Pierce, Midwestern head of the League, summarized, "We see this amendment as a weapon of the women's liberationists to destroy the family structure. We fear it will lead to marriage among homosexuals, the drafting of women into the Army, and the crumbling of the American family." The fear that the ERA would lead to changes in the traditional family structure and the downfall of American society led more conservative people to identify with the opposing side. They felt that the ERA went against their values and would change their way of life for the worse. The campaign also asserted that women already had rights and protection under the Constitution's 14th Amendment. Schlafly gained much support with statements like, "What I am defending is the real rights of women. A woman should have the right to be in the home as a wife and a mother." Jane J. Mansbridge, author of Why We Lost the ERA, attempted to examine Schlafly's effect on public support and, consequently, the failure of the Equal Rights Amendment. Mansbridge concludes, "The campaign against the ERA succeeded because it shifted debate away from equal rights and focused it on the possibility that the ERA might bring substantive changes in women's roles and behavior. In this era, the American public, though changing its outlook, still objected to any major changes in traditional roles of men and women. The fear that the Equal Rights Amendment would alter the status quo caused the public to vote against the Equal Rights Amendment." The women supporting the amendment were convinced that the ERA was the best tool for advancing the role of women in U.S. society. Early advocates for the ERA were mainly women who sought to play an equal role in the workplace and wanted to advance beyond the traditional roles for women. Supporters of the amendment believed the only way to gain equality for women was by sharing the same burdens as their male counterparts. This meant that women would also be eligible for the draft into the military, a sensitive issue after Vietnam. Also, laws that restricted women's rights to own property would be abolished, which would also affect divorce laws. Finally, pregnancy would be treated as a physical disability in the workplace. All feminists did not agree on every issue, and some women were unhappy with the extreme changes the amendment would bring to society. These women viewed the ERA as a threat to feminism, yet other women regarded the ERA as too weak. This internal tension among members of the women's movement eventually caused problems for the passage of the ERA. Despite originally working towards a common goal, conflicts arose among different sects of feminists, who ultimately led to the downfall of the ERA. There were two main approaches which could change the purpose of the ERA. This division in the feminist movement created conflicts over motive. Liberal feminists' main objective was equality for all, while cultural feminists strove to maintain the women's traditional role in the household. Liberal feminists did not want to distinguish between the sexes, and their primary goal was to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. The largest organization among this branch of feminism was NOW. In contrast, cultural feminists believed that men and women were different, should not be treated exactly the same, and therefore did not advocate for the ERA. Finally, the most fundamental of these groups, the radical feminists, believed that men oppressed women by choice and instinct. Although radical feminists supported the idea for a women's amendment, they advocated for an anti-subordination amendment. This internal disagreement caused setbacks in the feminist agenda. While NOW spearheaded the fight for the ERA in Washington through policy, other feminist groups, especially the radical ones, worked against NOW's mission. This internal disagreements prevented cooperation on any legislation. One radical group, the Red Stockings, founded in 1969, distrusted the patriarchal government structure and called for its destruction. Another radical group, the Society for Cutting Up Men, SCUM, created manifestos which called for the abolition of the male race, government, and money. Other conflicts in the feminist movement included arguments over the correct philosophy on childbirth, abortion, men, and sexuality. As Betty Friedan, author of The Feminine Mystique, explained, some radical feminists acted as the Lavender Menace, which worked against the liberal feminists and NOW's beliefs. Friedan's concern that all feminists would be viewed as lesbian radicals became a reality in the mid-70s. Conservatives, led by Schlafly, began to associate all feminists with the views of the radical group. They believed that all feminists desired to abolish America's ideal family and American values. Beginning in 1975, the pressure from anti-ERA groups was felt by state legislators. Despite this, in 1977, Indiana became the 35th state to ratify the ERA, leaving only 3 more states necessary for the ERA to become an amendment. The original March 22, 1979 deadline for the ERA ratification was fast approaching. Despite the feminist organization's effort, the ERA failed to gather the necessary votes. NOW lobbied to extend the deadline for the ERA's ratification, arguing that the Constitution did not state a time limit for ratification of amendments. NOW succeeded in their protest, and in October of 1977, Representative Elizabeth Holtzman introduced a bill that called for extension of the ERA deadline. The extension deadline for the ERA was approved in the House of Representatives, and 2 months later, the Senate also approved the deadline extension, which was reset to June 30, 1982. A new decade brought destructive changes to the ERA campaign. The Republican Party no longer supported the ERA as it had done for the last 40 years. In 1981, when Ronald Reagan was elected president, he actively opposed the amendment. The ERA never gained the support of the necessary 3 states. The supporters of the amendment were defeated but promised, "We'll remember in November." The supporters did remember, reintroducing the ERA to Congress in the July term of 1982, and have continued to reintroduce the amendment every year since. The failure to pass the ERA was due to the internal disagreement among women's groups and external societal pressure to maintain America's idealized family. The Equal Rights Amendment's main objective was to abolish inequalities for all women and people in the United States. Although the amendment did not pass, it fueled discussions for topics never before discussed in American society. New issues brought to national attention in the 1970s included the role of women in the workforce, abortion, same-sex marriage, and the role of women in the military. Although the Equal Rights Amendment failed to be ratified, it did fuel the debate which changed the mindset of Americans and revolutionized women's roles in American society.